For anyone who has ever attended a funeral, you know there's a certain finality to it. The casket is closed, the prayers are said, and slowly that wooden box is lowered into the ground. Dirt falls on top, one shovelful at a time, until the person you knew is covered by 6 feet of earth. It's meant to be peaceful, a final resting place, but for an incredibly unlucky few throughout history, that moment of being lowered into the ground wasn't the end at all. It was the beginning of the most terrifying experience imaginable. Because they weren't dead, they were alive, fully conscious, and they were about to be buried. What follows in these cases can only be described as a waking nightmare beyond comprehension. Trapped in complete darkness, surrounded by suffocating wood and earth, with oxygen running out and no way to call for help, every breath becomes a desperate gasp. Every movement is restricted by the tight confines of a coffin, never meant to hold a living person, and the crushing realization that nobody knows you're still alive, that your family is mourning you while you're screaming into the void, is a psychological torture that defies description. These are some of the most horrifying instances of people being buried alive, and I'm going to be honest with all of you. This is a topic that has haunted humanity for centuries, and upon really diving into these real cases, I found it to be so deeply disturbing that it shook me to my core. The idea that you could be mistakenly declared dead, that you could wake up in your own coffin, hearing the sound of dirt hitting the lid above you, it's the kind of horror that stays with you. So suffice to say, although I'll do my best to handle these stories with care, they are still extremely disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In August of 2015, a small cemetery in La Entrada, Honduras, became the site of one of the most disturbing events in recent memory. It was the day after the funeral of Nancy Perez, a 16-year-old girl who had been declared dead following a mysterious collapse. What happened in that cemetery would haunt everyone who witnessed it and raise terrifying questions about how we determine death. 1. Nancy had been 3 months pregnant when she collapsed at her home. According to witnesses, she had been experiencing what appeared to be a panic attack or seizure. She was foaming at the mouth and had lost consciousness. In the chaos that followed, an ambulance was called, but by the time medical personnel arrived and examined her, they pronounced her dead. The cause was believed to be a combination of shock and possibly some form of cardiac episode, though no extensive medical examination was performed. Her family was devastated. Within 24 hours, as is customary in Honduras's hot climate, Nancy was prepared for burial. She was dressed in her wedding dress, a tragic detail that made the story even more heartbreaking. You see, Nancy had been engaged to be married, and her family wanted her to be buried in the gown she would have worn at her wedding. They placed her in a coffin, held a funeral service, and buried her in the local cemetery in a concrete tomb. But Rudy Gonzalez, Nancy's husband-to-be, couldn't shake a terrible feeling. The next day, driven by a combination of grief and an inexplicable sense that something was wrong, he went to the cemetery. What he heard there would change everything. From inside the concrete tomb, he heard banging, desperate, rhythmic banging, like someone pounding on wood from the inside. Rudy immediately began screaming for help. Family members rushed to the cemetery, and what followed was a frantic scene as relatives used sledgehammers to break through the concrete tomb. The sound of banging continued, growing weaker as time passed. When they finally smashed through and pried open the coffin, what they found was both horrifying and heartbreaking. Nancy's body had moved. The glass viewing panel on the coffin was shattered from the inside, and there were injuries on her fingers consistent with desperate clawing and pounding. Her body had shifted position entirely. Most disturbing of all, some witnesses reported that when they first opened the coffin, they saw her eyes flutter and heard a faint gasp. Medics were called immediately. They rushed to perform CPR and attempted resuscitation, working frantically to bring her back. By this point, even if Nancy had been alive when she was banging on that coffin, she had been deprived of adequate oxygen for an extended period. The medics worked for hours, trying everything they could, but ultimately, they couldn't revive her. Nancy was pronounced dead a second time. The aftermath was devastating in ways that went far beyond simple grief. Nancy's mother, Maria, was inconsolable, not just with sorrow but with guilt and horror. The thought that her daughter had woken up in that coffin, that she had been conscious and terrified, banging desperately for help while buried alive, was unbearable. She had heard her daughter's final desperate attempts to escape and could do nothing to save her in time. Rudy Gonzalez, the fiancé who had heard the banging, was traumatized beyond measure. He told reporters that he would never forget the sound of those desperate thuds from inside the tomb. It played in his mind constantly. The what-ifs consumed him. What if he had gone to the cemetery an hour earlier? What if he had insisted on a more thorough medical examination before the burial? What if he had trusted his gut feeling from the beginning that something was wrong? The medical community in Honduras was forced to examine what had happened. How could a living person be declared dead? The initial examination had been brief, conducted in a chaotic home environment by emergency responders who may not have had access to sophisticated monitoring equipment. In Honduras, as in many developing nations, death certificates can sometimes be issued without the extensive verification procedures used in countries with more advanced medical infrastructure. Some medical experts suggested that Nacy might have been in a cataleptic state, a condition where the body becomes rigid and vital signs become so faint they're nearly undetectable without proper equipment. Others theorized she may have experienced a severe seizure that mimicked death, followed by a coma-like state. There was also speculation about whether she had been given any medications or substances that might have induced a death-like state, though nothing was ever proven. What made Nacy's case particularly haunting was the physical evidence. The shattered glass, the injuries on her hands, the changed position of her body. These weren't the signs of post-mortem movement or settling. These were the marks of a desperate struggle, of someone fighting with every ounce of strength to escape a nightmare that no one should ever have to experience. The case sparked outrage and debate across Honduras and internationally. It led to calls for stricter protocols in death certification, for mandatory waiting periods before burial, and for better training of medical personnel in death verification. But for Nacy's family, no policy change could undo what had happened. They were left to live with the knowledge that someone they loved had suffered one of the most terrifying deaths imaginable, and they had been the ones who, unknowingly, had sealed her fate. In July of 2011, a small town in Zimbabwe became the center of one of the most chilling premature burial cases in recent African history. This case involved a man named Brighton Damazentha, and what makes his story particularly disturbing is how long he remained trapped, conscious and aware, before anyone realized he was still alive. Brighton, a 34-year-old man from Gweru, Zimbabwe's third-largest city, was involved in a serious car accident on a rural road. The crash was severe, and when emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found Brighton unresponsive and showing no obvious signs of life. Given the limited medical resources available in rural Zimbabwe and the severity of the accident, a local medical officer examined him briefly at the scene and pronounced him dead. His body was transported to a local morgue, and his devastated family was notified of his death. Brighton's family, following traditional customs, quickly made arrangements for his funeral. In Zimbabwe, as in many African nations, bodies are typically buried within a day or two due to the hot climate and limited morgue facilities. Brighton's body was placed in a simple wooden coffin, and preparations began for a traditional funeral ceremony. Family members came from surrounding areas to mourn, and a funeral service was planned. But what no one knew was that Brighton wasn't dead. He was trapped in what medical professionals would later suggest was likely a deep comatose state, possibly induced by severe head trauma from the accident. His vital signs had become so faint, his breathing so shallow, that without sophisticated monitoring equipment, he appeared to have no signs of life. And now he was sealed in a coffin, with his funeral about to begin. For nearly 2 full days, Brighton lay in that coffin. During the wake, as is customary in Zimbabwean tradition, the coffin remained in the family home, with relatives keeping vigil. Family members sat nearby, praying and sharing memories of Brighton, completely unaware that he could hear them. Later, Brighton would recall fragments of those hours, muffled voices, the sensation of being unable to move, and an overwhelming feeling of suffocation and panic. On the day of the funeral, as mourners gathered for the burial ceremony, something extraordinary happened. Family members who were standing near the coffin heard a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sounds of grieving relatives, but then it became clearer. Crying. Someone was crying from inside the coffin. At first, people thought they were imagining it, that their grief was playing tricks on their minds, but as more people gathered around and the room fell silent, there was no mistaking it. The sound of weeping, of someone struggling to breathe, was definitely coming from inside Brighton's coffin. Some mourners screamed, others stood frozen in shock. Brighton's mother began shouting for someone to open the coffin immediately. Several men rushed forward and pried open the coffin lid. What they found inside was both miraculous and horrifying. Brighton's eyes were open, tears streaming down his face. He was conscious, aware, and crying weakly, His lips were moving as he tried to speak, though barely any sound came out. He had been alive the entire time, trapped in darkness, unable to move or call out loud enough to be heard, listening to his own funeral preparations. The scene erupted into chaos. Some people fainted from the shock. Others ran from the room in terror, believing they had witnessed something supernatural. Brighton's mother collapsed, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and horror. Someone immediately called for medical help, though the nearest hospital was miles away. When paramedics finally arrived, they found Brighton severely dehydrated, disoriented, and suffering from the effects of having been confined in a sealed coffin for nearly 2 days with limited oxygen. He was weak and could barely move, but he was undeniably alive. They rushed him to Gweru Provincial Hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize his condition. At the hospital, medical staff were baffled. How had he been declared dead? How had he survived nearly 2 days in a sealed coffin? Doctors theorized that Brighton had been in an extremely deep comatose state, possibly with brain swelling from the head trauma that had made his vital signs almost undetectable. The limited oxygen in the coffin, rather than killing him, may have actually helped preserve his brain function by inducing a kind of metabolic slowdown. Brighton's case made national headlines in Zimbabwe and eventually spread internationally. It sparked intense debate about medical practices in rural areas where access to sophisticated diagnostic equipment is limited. The medical officer who had pronounced Brighton dead faced scrutiny, though many pointed out that without an EEG or other advanced monitoring equipment, detecting such faint vital signs would have been nearly impossible under the circumstances. For Brighton himself, the psychological trauma was immense. He had fragmentary but terrifying memories of being conscious inside that coffin, of hearing his family mourn him, of struggling to move or cry out, of feeling his air running out. Even after his physical recovery, he suffered from severe claustrophobia and panic attacks. He couldn't enter small rooms or enclosed spaces without experiencing flashbacks to those 2 days of horror. His family was equally traumatized. Brighton's mother said she would never forgive herself for not somehow knowing her son was still alive. The guilt of having prepared her living son's funeral, of having him sealed in a coffin while he was conscious, haunted her. Other family members reported nightmares about the incident, unable to shake the image of Brighton's tear-stained face when they opened that coffin. The case also had a profound impact on the local community. People began questioning how many other premature burials might have occurred without anyone ever knowing. There were calls for better medical training, for mandatory waiting periods before burial, and for more thorough death verification procedures, even in resource-limited settings. Brighton's story became a powerful reminder that even in the modern era, with all our medical knowledge, the determination of death can sometimes be tragically wrong. His survival was nothing short of miraculous, but it came at the cost of experiencing one of humanity's most primal fears, being buried alive, conscious and aware, with the world believing you're gone. Just 3 years after Fageliu's terrifying experience, another case of premature burial made headlines, this time in the United States. In February of 2014, 78-year-old Walter Williams of Lexington, Mississippi, was pronounced dead at his home, setting in motion a chain of events that would shock his family, baffle medical professionals, and briefly turn a small-town funeral home into the site of something out of a horror movie. Walter had been in declining health for some time. He suffered from a variety of age-related ailments and had been under hospice care. On that February morning, his family called the hospice nurse when he appeared to have stopped breathing. The nurse arrived and performed a standard examination. She found no pulse, no respiration, no response to stimuli. By all the metrics available to her, Walter Williams appeared to be dead. She officially pronounced him deceased and began the process of notifying the appropriate authorities and the funeral home. A local coroner was called to the scene, as is standard procedure. He arrived, examined Walter's body, and concurred with the nurse's assessment. Walter Williams was legally declared dead, and his body was released to Porter & Sons Funeral Home in Lexington. The death certificate was filled out, listing the cause of death as heart failure, which seemed entirely consistent with Walter's medical history. At Porter & Sons, funeral director Byron Porter received the body and began preparations. Walter's family had requested that he be embalmed, a common practice in the American South. The funeral was scheduled for the following day, and Porter wanted to make sure everything was ready. He brought Walter's body into the preparation room and was about to begin the embalming process when something extraordinary happened. The body bag moved. At first, Porter thought he might be seeing things, that it was just the settling of the body or some other normal post-mortem occurrence, but then it moved again, more obviously this time, and then he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of breathing. Labored, raspy breathing was coming from inside the body bag. Porter quickly unzipped the bag, and what he saw made him stumble backwards in shock. Walter Williams's eyes were open, and he was looking around. His chest was rising and falling. The dead man was alive. Porter immediately called 911, his voice shaking as he tried to explain the impossible situation. "The man I was about to embalm just woke up," he told the dispatcher, who initially seemed to think it might be a prank call. An ambulance rushed to the funeral home, and paramedics found Walter alive, conscious and breathing on his own, though clearly disoriented and weak. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to Greenwood LaFleur Hospital, where doctors were waiting with a mixture of professional concern and complete bewilderment. How could a man who had been declared dead and sent to a funeral home be alive? At the hospital, Walter was immediately connected to monitoring equipment. His vital signs were weak but definitely present. His heart was beating. He was breathing. He was responsive to questions, though confused about what had happened to him. Medical staff performed a battery of tests, trying to understand what had occurred. Walter's family was notified that their supposedly deceased relative was in fact alive. His nephew, Eddie Hester, rushed to the hospital in a state of shock. He had just been planning his uncle's funeral, had been grieving his loss, had called relatives to inform them of the death, and now he was being told that Walter was alive and in the emergency room. When Eddie first saw his uncle in that hospital bed, alive and looking back at him, he broke down in tears of confusion, relief, and lingering fear. The case immediately attracted media attention. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the Mississippi man who had literally come back from the dead. Walter became briefly famous as Miracle Walter, though he himself didn't seem to fully understand what all the fuss was about. In interviews from his hospital bed, he seemed more annoyed than amazed, frustrated that people kept disturbing him when he just wanted to rest. But behind the scenes, medical professionals were scrambling to understand what had happened. How had both a hospice nurse and a coroner failed to detect signs of life? The most likely explanation was that Walter had experienced an extremely rare phenomenon, where his vital signs became so faint that they were virtually undetectable without sophisticated monitoring equipment. His breathing had become so shallow, his pulse so weak, that in a home environment without high-tech medical equipment, they appeared absent. For Byron Porter, the funeral director who had been moments away from beginning the embalming process, the experience was deeply traumatic. He told reporters that he had been in the funeral business for decades and had never come close to embalming someone who was still alive. The thought of what might have happened if he had started the procedure just a few minutes earlier, if he hadn't noticed the movement in the body bag, haunted him. The embalming process involves draining the blood and replacing it with preservative chemicals, a procedure that would have definitely killed Walter if he had still been alive when it began. Walter spent several weeks in the hospital recovering from his ordeal. Doctors stabilized his condition and addressed his various health issues. His family visited regularly, still marveling at the fact that they had gotten their relative back after already beginning to grieve his loss. Tragically, but perhaps inevitably, Walter Williams did pass away for real just a few weeks later in April 2014. This time, there was no doubt, no miraculous awakening at the funeral home. Before dawn had fully broken on January 7, 2018, a bizarre and unsettling scene was unfolding inside the maximum security wing of Asturias Central Penitentiary in northwest Spain. What began during a morning roll call would soon become one of the most shocking premature death cases in modern history. Gonzalo Montoya Jimenez, a 29-year-old inmate serving time for robbery, was found unresponsive in his cell. He was sitting in a chair, motionless, with no signs of violence or struggle. Prison staff immediately alerted the on-duty medical team. 2 prison doctors examined him, searching for any sign of life. There was no detectable pulse, no measurable breathing, no response of any kind. Both physicians came to the same conclusion. Jimenez was dead. An hour later, a forensic doctor arrived to verify the assessment. After inspecting the body, he confirmed the earlier evaluations and issued a third official death report. With 3 medical confirmations, procedures moved forward. Jimenez's body was zipped into a morgue bag and transported to the hospital mortuary. There, he was placed in cold storage to await autopsy. Pathologists even marked his skin with scalpel guidelines, preparing for the examination that was supposed to begin shortly. But then something happened, something no one in the morgue expected. A sound that absolutely should not come from inside a body bag in a morgue. Snoring. At first, the pathologists thought it might be coming from another room, but the noise persisted, soft, rhythmic, unmistakably human. They traced it to the bag on the table. They opened it. Ximenez was alive, not only alive but breathing, moving, and very much not dead. El Español later reported. Montoya was not dead, quite the opposite. Ximenez was immediately rushed under guard to another hospital for emergency care. Doctors described his condition as mysterious, but ultimately stable. How could 3 medical professionals mistake a living man for a corpse? Prison authorities admitted they had no explanation. All they could say was that clinical signs of death had been present at the time. Later analysis suggested that Ximenez's body showed signs of cyanosis and even rigor mortis, both of which can mislead examiners. Hospital staff proposed that he had suffered a rare episode of catalepsy, a trance-like state characterized by immobility, loss of sensation, and muscles becoming rigid enough to mimic death. Ximenez had epilepsy and took medication for it, but his family revealed he struggled to follow his prescription schedule in prison. This lapse may have played a role. In intensive care, it took 24 hours for him to fully regain consciousness and begin communicating. When he finally woke and spoke, his first request was simple: "Can I see my wife?" The bizarre case sent shockwaves through Spain and raised serious questions about medical verification procedures, especially within correctional facilities. One thing was clear: if the pathologists had begun the autopsy just minutes earlier, Gonzalo Montoya Ximenez might not have lived to tell the tale. In August of 2020, a suburb of Detroit became the site of one of the most disturbing medical errors in recent American history. This case involved a 20-year-old woman named Timesha Beauchamp, and what makes her story particularly tragic is that the very mistake that led to her being declared dead would ultimately cause her actual death just 2 months later. Timesha was born with cerebral palsy and was nonverbal, requiring constant medical care including 3 breathing treatments every day. On the morning of August 23, 2020, she began experiencing serious breathing problems at her family's home in Southfield, Michigan. Her terrified family called 911 around 7:30 a.m. Paramedics from the Southfield Fire Department arrived and found Timesha unresponsive and not breathing. They immediately began CPR and worked for 30 minutes trying to revive her. When they detected no pulse, no breathing, and no response, they contacted an emergency room doctor by telephone. The doctor, relying on information from the first responders, pronounced Timesha deceased around 8 a.m. But then something extraordinary happened. Timesha's godmother, Savannah Spears, a registered nurse, wasn't convinced. As she held Timesha and prayed, she felt a faint pulse. She immediately told the paramedics that Timesha was still alive, that she could feel her heart beating and saw her chest moving. The paramedics dismissed her concerns. They explained these were involuntary movements caused by the medications they had administered, normal post-mortem reflexes, but Savannah insisted. The paramedics returned to check 3 times, and each time reported finding no signs of life. What nobody realized was that when they had placed a heart monitor on Timesha 13 minutes after stopping CPR, it showed organized electrical activity. Her heart was still beating, but this critical information was missed. With the death certificate issued, the family called the James H. Cole Funeral Home in Detroit. The funeral home arrived around 11:25 a.m., more than 3 hours after Timesha had been declared dead. Timesha's body was placed in a body bag, and for more than 2 hours she remained sealed inside it. She was breathing, her heart was beating, and her eyes were open, but no one knew. When Timesha arrived at the funeral home, she was taken to the preparation room where embalming would begin. The embalmer unzipped the body bag to start his work. What he saw made him freeze. Timesha's eyes were open. Her chest was moving up and down. She was gasping for air. The woman declared dead over 3 hours ago was alive. The funeral home immediately called 911. Paramedics found Timesha in critical condition, barely conscious and severely oxygen deprived. She was rushed to Sinai Grace Hospital in Detroit. Doctors discovered she had suffered severe hypoxic brain damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation. Because she had been conscious during at least part of her ordeal in that body bag, she had endured unimaginable suffering. Her family received a phone call that no family should ever receive. First told their daughter was dead, they had begun grieving and planning a funeral. Then, hours later, they learned she was alive but had been found at a funeral home about to be embalmed. The psychological shock was incomprehensible. Timesha's mother, Erica Lattimore, released a statement. "We are devastated by what has happened. We are shocked, confused, and we don't understand how this could happen to our Timesha. Timesha remained in critical condition, on a ventilator with doctors describing her prognosis as touch and go. The brain damage was extensive. The city of Southfield launched an investigation. Fire Chief Johnny Menifee suggested it might be Lazarus syndrome, where people spontaneously come back to life after failed resuscitation. But medical experts questioned this, especially since Timesha's godmother had reported signs of life immediately. The 4 first responders were placed on administrative leave and had their licenses suspended by the state of Michigan. For nearly 2 months, Timesha fought for her life. Her family visited daily, hoping for a miracle. But the damage was too severe. On October 18, 2020, Timesha Beauchamp died at Children's Hospital in Detroit. Her family released a heartbreaking statement. "Our whole family is devastated. This is the second time our beloved Timesha has been pronounced dead, but this time she isn't coming back." Jeffrey Feger, the family's attorney, was direct about what killed her. She died as a result of massive brain damage that was suffered when Southfield paramedics wrongly declared her dead and failed to provide her much-needed oxygen. Instead, she was sent to a funeral home, which then discovered that her eyes were open and that she was alive. The family filed a $50 million federal lawsuit against the city of Southfield and the 4 first responders. The lawsuit detailed how paramedics had ignored a trained nurse's concerns, missed monitor readings showing cardiac activity, and condemned Timesha to hours of suffering that led to her death. The case raised disturbing questions. How could trained paramedics declare someone dead when equipment showed signs of life? Why were a registered nurse's concerns dismissed? Many questioned whether Timesha's disability played a role in how she was treated, whether paramedics were less thorough because she was nonverbal. Chief Menifee denied this, but the questions remained. For the funeral home staff, the trauma was immense. The embalmer who opened that body bag and found Timesha with her eyes open, gasping for air, moments before he would have begun embalming her, would be haunted by that image forever. He had been seconds away from a procedure that would have killed her. More than 5 years later, the legal battle continues. The city has fought the lawsuit using governmental immunity claims, filing multiple appeals. Timesha's family still hasn't had their day in court. Her mother remains determined. "I'm not giving up," Erica Lattimore said. "I will go through the long haul, however long it takes." She lived 20 years. "If it takes 20 more years for this to get heard in court, and God gives me the breath, I'm there." If there's anything to take from all these horrifying accounts, from Nizi Perez banging on her coffin in Honduras, to Walter Williams waking up at a funeral home in Mississippi, to Gonzalo Montoya calling from a morgue drawer in Spain, it's that the fear of being buried alive is not just ancient superstition, it's real, and it still happens. These stories show just how unpredictable death determination can be. For some, it's hours of unimaginable horror that leaves lifelong scars. For others, it ends in tragedy. But whether the experience is survived or not, the common thread is the same. The patient was supposed to be unconscious, and they weren't. Death determination isn't foolproof. It requires vigilance, constant monitoring, and quick responses when things don't go as planned. Equipment can fail, vital signs can become undetectable, and human error can creep in. For those unlucky enough to wake up declared dead, the aftermath can be devastating, with flashbacks, anxiety, and PTSD that lingers for years, or worse. And if there's one takeaway, it's this: families have the right to ask questions. The difference between being correctly declared dead and waking up in a coffin could come down to one extra check, one more minute of observation, or one person willing to listen when something doesn't feel right. If you made it this far, thanks for reading. These stories represent real people who endured something unimaginable and serve as a reminder that vigilance in determining death isn't just protocol, it's life and death.